Okay, good morning, everybody. Welcome at ETH Zürich. Those who don't know me, I'm the local host. My name is Elsbeth Stern, and we are happy to host this conference. Also, welcome on behalf of my university. You may have seen we are a little bit a special university, a technical university. We don't have psychology study programs, only STEM study programs. But there are also some strange bird professors like me, psychology. We have it because we have a big teacher education program in the STEM subjects. And of course, learning science is part of the STEM studies. Therefore, we are interested, of course, in what makes or how can we find STEM talents, and particularly how can we promote them. So I myself, I'm a psychologist, and I have been interested in intelligence research almost all my life, at least since I was studying psychology, which is almost 50 years ago. And at the end, I ended up as an educational psychologist. But one of my goals is to bring both fields together, because I think they started together, intelligence research and the educational psychology, but after a time they became a kind of estranged siblings. And this is because intelligence researchers focused a little bit too much on individual differences, but didn't take into consideration that you can really improve by learning. And on the other hand, educational psychologists thought if they have wonderful learning environments, everybody can improve. That's right. But of course, the differences between people don't decrease if you have good learning environments. They just amplify. And this has to be taken into consideration. And I like very much the sentence from Sandra Scar that environment is responsible for the mean. That means learning environments are responsible for the mean learning outcome. But of course, genes are responsible for variance, and we shouldn't strive to make everybody the same, but we can improve everybody. That's just our mission. I think there is, we know, of course, the big impact of genes on learning outcomes, but at the same time, there is no direct path from the DNA to the scores in the IQ test. The human brain was developed 40,000 years ago. Of course, it was not developed for being good in intelligence tests. Nonetheless, we improved. But we need a good environment to help intelligence to emerge. And I hope this conference will contribute to insights which really help us to better understand learning and to better understand the individual differences and how we can improve learning. So before I hand over to Tom, some practical remarks. First, I would like to introduce Juliette Fong. She is my office manager. She grew up in Philadelphia. She is native English speaker, so whenever you have a problem, she can solve it. And more people than originally registered want to come to the banquet on Tuesday evening. I still have 25 vouchers. Who needs a voucher? Yeah, so I will distribute them later on. Great. So if you don't need it, please give it back, because we have to pay for every person, and we had to squeeze every penny here to make this conference work. You know about the prices in Switzerland. Therefore, we would be happy if we could cooperate. Another thing, who will not have lunch today? So, but I think we still need some additional resources. I will go to our chef and we'll see what he has in his freezer to see whether, so I'm sure nobody will starve, but only 60 people registered for lunch, but I think now there will be some more, but I will make sure it works. Then I will hand over to Tom, and have a nice conference.
Thanks. Thanks, Elsbeth. Very nicely done. Good morning, everybody. I'm Tom Coyle. I'm the president of the society and a professor of psychology at the University of Texas at San Antonio. I'd like to begin with a little old Texas story, and it's if you're traveling down a long, desolate road and see a turtle perched on the top of a fence post, you know it got there with some help. And with that in mind, I'd like to thank some of the people who have helped me prepare and organize this conference, starting with Elsbeth. I know you just clapped for her, but I think it would be good to hand her another round of applause. All the local arrangements, Elsbeth has handled completely, and I applaud you for that. Please. Thank you so much. I couldn't have pulled it off without you. There are some other people who deserve some recognition here. I thought I saw Emily Willoughby somewhere. Is Emily here? Emily, could you please stand up again? Emily stood up last night at the Marriott. Emily has developed the entire program. So what you see in front of you, for those of you who have a hard copy of the program, was done entirely by Emily, including the wonderful graphic of the brain in Zürich, which I think is also on a T-shirt. Am I correct, Emily? Which can be purchased. $20 a piece. And the proceeds will go to ISIR. So please, if you're so inclined, purchase a T-shirt. It's going for a good cause. A couple of other quick mentions. Tobias Edwards may also be here, or is he still sleeping? I don't know. He's my treasurer. He's right behind. Thank you so much, Tobias. Tobias handles all the finances. He makes sure everybody gets paid. Without doing that, you don't have a conference. We have a wonderful lineup, as you know. I was told I invited more speakers than anyone has in the past. I think 8 total. Maybe I overdid it in my first year as a president, but it's a terrific lineup, starting with Matt McGue. And with that in mind, let me turn briefly to Matt. Matt was a consensus pick for the Lifetime Achievement Award by the Society. I'll have more prepared remarks to say during our banquet when we honor Matt and also honor Wendy Johnson, who is sitting up here and who was unable to receive the Lifetime Achievement Award last year in Berkeley. Thanks so much for coming, Wendy. What I'd like to say now, I don't want to say much about Matt's research other than he's receiving it for his contributions to behavioral genetics, on intelligence and traits in general. But if we had also an award for the top mensch, Yiddish term for an honorable person who helps the society specifically, Matt would also receive it for that. We don't, though, Matt, so you're receiving only the Lifetime Achievement Award for your contributions to science. And with that in mind, I'll turn it over to Matt, and I'll let him do his thing. Thank you so much, everybody, for coming.
Thank you, Tom. I'm going to pass along that mensch comment to my Jewish in-laws. They were a little shocked when I first turned up at the door. I want to begin by thanking the Society for giving me this honor. It was unexpected, it was humbling, but ultimately was much appreciated. To be honest, I'm not sure I deserve it. Whatever success I've had in my career owes principally to 2 groups of individuals. The first is I've been blessed with a set of very generous mentors over the various stages of my career. Tom Bouchard, who was my PhD advisor. Irving Gottesman, the famous schizophrenia researcher. D.C. Rao, you might not know. D.C. Rao is an eminent statistician who helped me early in my career. My first academic job was in a department of biostatistics. DC was the head of that department. And David Licken, who's the father of twin research at the University of Minnesota. So I've been blessed, like hopefully most of you, with a great set of mentors. And the second group of individuals are colleagues that I've had the pleasure of collaborating with. I've collaborated with many, many colleagues over the years. I've identified a few here because they're colleagues I've collaborated with on the research I'll talk about today. Aldo Rustacini is an economist at the University of Minnesota. Alex, James, Wendy, Emily, I think you all know Bill Iacono is a behavioral geneticist and clinical psychologist at the University of Minnesota. Really, they've helped keep me honest. I'm not dispositionally a dishonest person, but they've challenged me throughout in my work. I think it's worth mentioning, Tom mentioned that Wendy won this award last year. Wendy was a PhD student of mine, and she reminded me yesterday that she finished 20 years ago. Wendy was always about a year ahead of me, so I think that sounds just about right. Throughout my career, I've really been interested, both professionally and personally, in the impact of families. How do families influence our psychological development? I've studied many traits, and what I'll talk about today is just that. This is not only a professional interest of mine, but it's also a deeply personal interest of mine. If you don't mind an indulgence of mine, these are my parents. On the left happens to be in 1947 on the night of their first date. And then the picture on the right is about 40 years later, kind of how I remember them after being happily married for almost 40 years. I think my parents had a profound impact on the person I ended up being, even though my field, and we'll talk a little bit about this, even though my field suggests otherwise. And so what I'd like to talk with you here today is, why do I believe that? And what does behavioral genetics tell us about the environmental impact? I'm not going to talk too much about genetics, but the environmental impact of families on our life. I'm not alone in thinking that families are a principal driver of psychological development. It may be the only thing that politicians throughout the spectrum agree on, that families are important to child development, both on the right and on the left. And because of that, we have a lot of policies, government policies, that try to support the formation and the lives of people's families. Even radicals have been impressed by the power of family, so impressed that they would like to get, at least some, would like to get rid of families. This goes back to really Plato. I think Plato, as far as I know, is the first one to talk about the need to get rid of families because families were in competition with the interests of the state. So Plato in the Republic argued that children should be taken from their parents and communally reared and educated. Of course, Engels famously said that the family should be abolished because the family was essentially an engine of inequality, and that, moreover, what families did is they socialized children into the belief that capitalism was a good economic system. And more recently, some feminists have argued for the abolition of families because families are seen as a way of perpetuating paternalistic systems. So politicians, our personal experience, maybe many of you here, radicals, but perhaps most important for us are scientists. Scientists also, at least developmental scientists, have argued for the importance of families and particularly parents in psychological development. Maybe the most prominent researcher of the impact of parenting is Diana Baumrind. She passed away a few years ago. She was a professor actually at my alma mater at UC Berkeley. Baumrind is best known for her tripartite theory of parenting, that there are three types of parents. Authoritative, that's good, I guess. Authoritarian, that's clearly not good. And permissive, that's probably where I end up parenting. It may come as a surprise to some of you that given the broad consensus about the importance that parents play in our life, that behavioral geneticists have long questioned whether or not parents help shape our psychological development. This goes back early you go back 100 years in the early behavioral genetic literature. I won't go back that far with you. But it really, I think, kind of escalated in the 1990s with the publication of a couple books that maybe some of you are familiar with. David Rowe, who passed away way too early in his life. I think David Rowe was Robert Plomin's first PhD student. David was a great person. He wrote a book that I think the first popular book, trade book, that really questioned whether or not parents influenced our psychological development, questioning the impact of socioeconomic status, the types of things that Diana Baumrind was doing. Maybe more significantly was a book that was published 4 years later, it was, I think, a New York Times bestseller by Judy Harris. She was an extraordinary person. She warranted a New York Times obituary, the title of which included the words "played down role of parents." So she went to her grave known for questioning whether or not parents influence our psychological development. For Judy, her belief was that she actually was not. David Rowe was a behavioral geneticist. Judy Harris was a developmental psychologist who wrote textbooks. She actually was not an academic. But given her very incisive review of the relevant literature, in writing her textbook, she had come to the conclusion that developmental psychology had grossly overestimated the importance of parenting, and that she herself was in favor with peers really driving development, at least environmentally. So what was the basis for David and Judy Harris and others' conclusion, behavioral geneticists' conclusion in the 1990s, 30 years ago, that parenting may not be as important as the developmentalists had thought? Well, most of it came from twin studies. I'm not going to talk about twin studies. I've done a lot of twin studies in my career. I'm not going to talk about any of them here today, other than twin studies done by other people. And the central first observation of this that I'm aware of was done by John Lowland, who was a professor, well-known behavioral geneticist at the University of Texas. And what Lowland had done was, at that time, was kind of a revolutionary twin study. I forget, it's several hundred pairs of twins, I think like 500 or 600, which was a gigantic sample back in the 1970s. And he was studying personality traits, like the Big Five, although it wasn't called the Big Five back in the 1970s. And what he was interested in really is, back then, there was a question about whether or not individual differences in personality were in part inherited. So that's why he was doing this twin study. But the most remarkable observation he made was that using biometrical methods, and I'm not going to get into biometry here, but using standard biometrical methods, he could observe that the environment was very important to individual differences in traits like neuroticism or extroversion, accounted for 50% of the variance. But that the type of environment that he inferred operating was pretty much independent of what developmental psychologists had focused on. It was what behavioral geneticists called the non-shared environment. The shared environment, the effect of growing up in the same home, the magnitude of the effect of the shared environment can be inferred from a twin study indirectly using the pattern of correlation there. That if you see a correlation of the MZ twins that exceeds at least twofold the DZ twin, then that implies that the shared environment has no effect. But obviously that's an indirect inference. But that's the pattern he observed. Well, he observed it for personality in a sample of several hundred, but that pattern actually holds up quite well for a lot of traits. A few years ago, Tinka Polderman and her colleagues at Free University in the Netherlands did a massive meta-analysis. There are a lot of twin research going on in the world still. What does it say? It's over 14 million pairs of twins and almost 3,000 twin studies published. She looked at twin studies of every possible trait. So many of these are not psychological. But the pattern that Lowland observed, that the MZ twin correlation was at least twice the DZ correlation, in the personality data in 1976, she observed in 70% of these 17,800 traits. Well, that's a lot of different traits. Some are blood pressure, height, weight, What about the psychological ones? Did the same pattern hold? That overwhelmingly, the reared together twin study suggested that it was the shared environment was not important. In fact, for 57% of the cognitive, 62% of psychiatric, and oddly enough, the ones you would expect the shared environment to be more powerful, social values, 70%, the same pattern held. The MZ twin correlation was at least twice the DZ twin correlation, suggesting that the shared environment was not particularly important. It wasn't just studies of reared together twins, which is what Tinka Polderman meta-analyzed, but also, and in particular, in the case of Judy Harris, study of reared apart twins that came out of behavioral genetic research and suggested limited impact of the shared environment. Maybe arguably one of the most famous, if not the most famous study of reared apart twins was done at my university by my PhD mentor, Tom Bouchard. A study of I forget, Wendy, I don't know how many, it was about 150 pairs of reared apart twins, something on that order. And this is from a science paper published in 1990 by Tom and his colleagues. And what's plotted here is a comparison of the correlation for a selected set of traits. He measured many more things than this, but this kind of representative. The red bar is the correlation for MZ twins reared apart. The whatever color that is, blue bar is the correlation for MZ twins reared together. And the inference or the logic is pretty simple. If growing up in the same home is important to psychological development, then the blue bars should be substantially larger than the red bars. But you can see that in general, that's not the case. In fact, the only one that tends to be exceptional in that regard, interestingly enough, is probably the one most people here are interested in, and it's IQ. The difference there is that he reported back in 1990 was a difference of 0.2. So on the one hand, you have behavioral geneticists doing twin studies up through the 1990s that they concluded that if you tried to draw an inference about the proportion of variance in a phenotype associated with growing up in the same home, using either reared together twins, primarily reared together twin studies, but also reared apart twin studies, that for most traits, it didn't seem to matter very much. But you had many more developmental psychologists like Diana Baumrind, who would do studies of parent-offspring resemblance. So Baumrind would make the observation repeatedly that if you had what she would consider authoritative parents, that authoritative parents were more likely to have children who were competent, both academically and in terms of mental health, than parents who were authoritarian or permissive. So what rectified these two literatures that seemed to be in conflict? The resolution, at least from a behavioral genetic perspective, is that the types of study Baumrind were doing were subject to genetic confounding in a statistical sense, or from a more theoretical perspective, that they had not taken into account gene-environment correlation. Sandy Scar talked about three different types of gene-environment correlation, two of which I'm going to talk about here this morning. Make sure I don't go over my time. Passive is the type of gene-environment correlation that behavioral geneticists back in the 90s, and indeed today, have argued is the problem with the types of studies Baumrind was doing. So again, she would certainly observe in multiple samples, so it's a robust observation that authoritative parents were more likely to have competent children, let's say authoritarian parents. Why was that the case? She thought it was because they were authoritative and they provided a rearing environment that fostered competency. What the behavioral geneticists argued, well, is that you failed to take into account gene-environment correlation, passive gene-environment correlation, genetic confounding. Competent parents have genes that underlie their competency, and they authoritative parents have genes that underlie their being authoritative parents, and they transmit those genes to their children, and that fosters the development of competency. So the observations that she was making owe to this passive gene-environment correlation. A little bit later, I'll talk about reactive, what Sandy called reactive or evocative gene-environment correlation. I won't talk about the third type. Reactive gene-environment correlation corresponds to correlations that owe to the fact that, in part, our experiences in the world are in part a function of how people react to the way we're behaving. And to the extent our behavior is heritable, then our experiences become correlated with our underlying genotypes. In any case, Robert Plomin, in a book I commend to you that he published 5 years ago, Blueprint, pretty much sums up the behavioral genetic perspective on the importance of the shared environment, or more narrowly, parenting. That really, if you look at people growing up in the same home, the reason they're psychologically similar, they have similar academic outcomes, so to the extent they have similar personalities, interests, social values, it owed to their shared genotypes, not to the fact that they shared an environment. What I'd like to do in terms of talking about my own research here, I'm actually going to just focus on one study, which could be a mistake, but you'll let me know, is I'd like to investigate the proposition that growing up together has little impact on our psychological development. I still believe, and maybe many of you do, I don't know, that my parents really did, that I would be a different person had I not grown up with my parents. But again, I'm a behavioral geneticist, and does the literature support me? Some would say no. But I'd like to investigate that using a traditional behavioral genetic design. Genomics is a wonderful development in our field, but sometimes traditional designs afford a certain amount of power. And the design I'm going to use is an adoption study. And the study I'm going to talk about is a study we call SIBS, Sibling Interaction and Behavior Study. And I won't bore you with why the acronym is SIBS. SIBS is a study of adoptive families. Now, in Minnesota, we don't have access to the types of registries that exist in the Nordic countries. So getting a sample of adopted families is not straightforward. But remarkably, we started the study in 1998. Remarkably, back then, we were given access to the adoption records of the 3 largest adoption agencies in Minnesota. And they did a lot of placements. So we actually, I doubt the IRB, the ethics board, would let us do this again. Although we had no problems, 0 problems. But that we had access to the adoption records was pretty amazing. We had a good relationship with the adoption agencies. So one of the things is we can't get these gigantic samples like you can get Denmark or Sweden, but at least they're systematically ascertained. We identified eligible families from records and then went out and ascertained them and recruited them. And in total, there are 617 4-member families in the study. There are 3 types of families. There are families where both children are adopted. One child is adopted and one is a birth child, genetically related to parents. And then we also have about 200 families, a little over 200 families, where we have genetically related siblings, full biological siblings. And they were also systematically ascertained from birth records are public in Minnesota, so we could get them through the birth records. The first, I'm going to try to highlight what I think 3 inferences that a traditional behavioral genetic design, like studying adoptive families, allow us to do. The first is just drawing an inference of how important growing up together is on psychological development. I still think it's really kind of an interesting question. If you take 2 individuals who are not genetically related to one another, but they grow up in the same home, in the end, how psychologically similar are they? And what are they similar in? That's the first question we'll try to answer. And it turns out, just biometrically, the correlation in adopted siblings estimates this, in principle, the same under certain assumptions, the same estimate that's coming out of those twin studies, the proportion of variance associated with growing up together. And flip back here, just for purposes of ease of presentation, as well as statistical power, maximize statistical power, I'm going to pool the adopted the sibling pairs in these two families. Biometrically, they have slightly different expectations, but at least conceptually, they're both talking about siblings who grew up together that are not genetically related to one another. And I have about 400 pairs of those in the study. So then what I'll call the adopted sibling correlation gives me an estimate directly of the impact of growing up together. And we also have these non-adopted siblings, and for which then their correlation reflects not only growing up together, but also the extent to which genetics is important. Although, again, I'm not too interested in genetics here, other than trying to get rid of it to understand how the environment is working. So the SIB sample, we've completed. Is that me? I don't know. Oh, okay. I thought maybe I had to go somewhere. Oh, okay, I'm still good at it. Okay, no problem. So the SIP sample, we've gone through 4 waves of assessment. The last wave we just completed a little while ago, and actually there's a 5th wave of assessment now. In this, we've had a little attrition. I'd be interested in talking with other people doing longitudinal research. Through the first 2 waves of follow-up, we had participation above 90%. The most recent wave was about 70%. So we've had some attrition over time, but still a reasonably large sample. I'm going to, for the most part here, focus on 2 developmental stages, adolescence and adulthood. So the last follow-up that we've completed, and then the initial intake. When I have 617 families, and again, they're 4-member families, we don't always get the dads. But we almost always get the dads, so it's about 2,400 people in total. And we measure a lot of, so I'm going to focus first on adolescents. We measure a lot of traits. I've just picked out fairly a representative 30 different phenotypes here, and I've organized them thematically, not empirically. It's not that necessarily that traits within a certain category here all correlate highly with one another. That actually is not the case. And some, like the personality traits don't necessarily correlate very highly with that. So I've got 5 different domains here. Academic, which maybe is the one most relevant for this society, substance use and abuse, which is the primary funder of our research, and mental health, as well as mental health, personality traits, social values. And social values will turn out to be, I think, very interesting. So the first thing I'm going to do very simply is just compute all those sibling correlations, and then I've displayed them here in 5. I was looking for a pattern. There's not really much of a pattern here. A box plot of the 30 correlations, and I just want to highlight, both for non-adopted and adopted siblings in the 5 different domains, just highlight a couple things. Across the 30 traits, almost always the non-adopted siblings, those that are biologically related, were more similar than the adopted siblings. That's genetics. And again, I'm not that interested in that. We know genetics is, as was pointed out, we know genetics is important. I'm trying to factor that out to look at the environment here. So consistently, the non-adopted are more similar. If you look across the adopted, I know that the mean correlation is maybe not particularly the best way to summarize things here, and I'll drill down a little bit more. But except for the social values domain, kind of on average, the typical correlation is about 10%, which is not trivial, but it's not a large number either. The one exception is social values, but that's being driven by an outlier, which turns out to be religiousness, which is really an interesting trait. So if we look at these correlations, just the adopted sibling correlations in a different way, if a sample is 400 pairs, then the standard error of the correlation is about 0.05. So roughly almost 50% of the correlations are less than 10%. 30% or 15% or greater, which I would say, although there's no particular pattern to them, the 3 highest correlations, for example, were religiousness, which was 0.47. So two genetically unrelated individuals growing up in the same home. In adolescence, their level of religious commitment and belief is correlated at almost 0.5. That's not trivial. It's suggesting 50% variance being accounted for. So religiousness and the other two are symptoms of nicotine dependence and symptoms of conduct disorder. There's no pattern. You'll see when we get to adulthood, I would argue there is going to be a pattern. I've been blessed with great PhD students, Wendy and others. Another one of my former PhD students, Alex Bird at Michigan State University, a few years ago, did a meta-analysis of shared environmental influences, looking at both twin and adoption studies for various mental health outcomes. And interestingly enough, our correlations across more domains than mental health are pretty consistent. For the most part, these are the estimates of C-squared. They're between 10 and 15%, externalizing conduct disorder, internalizing anxiety, depression. Led Alex to conclude, in sum, these results suggest that the shared environment influences play a clear role in the presence of child and adolescent psychopathology. So in adolescence, many traits don't seem to have much of a shared environmental effect, but there are some exceptions. My PhD advisor has told me many times, well, big deal. Tom, this is Tom. If you knew Tom, you would know he would say something like, well, big deal. Tom would say, well, okay, you're talking about kids or adolescents. We know it's a volatile developmental period. Come back and tell me about it when they grow up. I'll be interested then. Tom wrote a paper to support his view. They published it a couple years ago, and he called it the Wilson effect. Ron Wilson was a twin researcher at the University of Louisville. And what Tom was interested in this paper is that for IQ, or general cognitive ability, the heritability appears to increase with age. But the complement of that is that the shared environmental component also decreases with age. So as the heritability goes up, the shared environmental component goes down. And so I've abstracted, he has a figure 1 that mostly is focused on heritability, but I've abstracted out the twin research that Tom had in that figure 1 that supports his view that the shared environment for IQ, and the view of others as well, diminishes maybe to 0 once you hit adulthood. A large study from the Netherlands by Dorette Boomsma and her colleagues, and another cross-sectional study by Claire Hayworth from England. Well, we have longitudinal data. This is cross-sectional data. So we're kind of in a good position to maybe test this Wilson effect this is for IQ, for a broader range of traits. Although we have longitudinal data, as any of you who've done longitudinal research will know, it can be very challenging to measure the same phenotype at every wave of assessment. The participants change psychologically, so the same assessments don't even work. Or in some cases, you have constraints because of the funding, why you got the funding, and so things have to be dropped out of the assessment. So even though we've measured a lot of things, it's not necessarily the case that we've measured the same thing the same way at 4 waves of assessment. But some things we have, and they show the pattern that Tom predicted. This is for religiousness. It might be different in Europe. This is the US. US is more religious than Europe is more secular. But anyway, it shows the pattern that Tom talked about. The blue dots or whatever it is, squares, are the correlations for these adopted siblings at each wave. And again, they begin in adolescence, they end up on average in their 30s. The red is the non-adopted siblings. And what you see is that in adolescence, there's not a big difference between the two. But as they get older, they both decline. But in particular, the adopted sibling correlation declines. It's not 0 in adulthood. It's still about 20%. But clearly the impact, which you might expect, the impact of growing up together declines with age. Is that true of other traits? I'm going to just briefly, I don't want to get into biometrics, but we can ask, using pretty standard biometric models, whether or not the shared environmental effect that existed when these individuals were in adolescence is the same one as when they were 30 years old. And these are the correlations between the shared environmental effects. The answer is basically the correlation is not 1, but it's really high. It's above 0.9. So what you're seeing is the same shared environmental effect, but it's diminishing in its impact over time. I can't really do that for all the traits. I can do it for some, but not all. But what I can do is, in our last follow-up, we measured a lot of traits. And so there are actually 44 different phenotypes here. Again, they're 30 years old. I've, again, thematically organized them. One got dropped off here. I'm trying to think. I can't remember what the one got dropped off. I can't see it on my screen either. Anyway, but that's okay. Academic is maybe the one you're most interested in, but we've also measured things. Are they good citizens? Do they volunteer? Are they involved in their communities? Their economic phenotypes, social values. We've extensively expanded the assessment. So now I can look at 44 correlations in the adopted siblings, 44 in the non-adopted siblings. And again, it's a little, the legend is not especially helpful here because it's hard to see the dots maybe. But I'll drill down on it because there is a pattern here. Again, the non-adopted are more similar. Now they're 30 on average. The non-adopted are consistently more similar than the adopted. I think in 40 and 44 out of 44 comparisons, they were numerically, not always statistically significantly more similar, but they were more similar. That's genetics. And at least on average, they're not as similar for these traits as they were for the other traits, but it's a different pool of traits. But they are pretty similar for some traits. And they're now long moved out of that rearing home. So the traits that they're more similar for are traits that suggest that there might be enduring impacts of growing up in the same home. So I'd like to focus on these. There are actually 8 traits here, but roughly 20% of what we looked at, where the correlation was at least 0.15. And a correlation of 0.15, I think, is significant at less than 0.01 for sure here. These are the 8, it gets cut off. It's too bad. These are the 8 traits, I can't change, try to change it, ordered by the magnitude of the correlation that show the highest correlation. Now, I recognize by taking the ones that have the highest correlation, I'm biasing the estimate. So these are likely overestimates because I'm just selecting the strong one. But what I'm interested in is the pattern. Is there primarily two domains for which we see, I would say, relatively strong adopted sibling correlations now in early adulthood? Social values. So GSS social are things like essentially social liberalism, belief in that marijuana should be legalized, birth control should be widely provided, free, and whatnot. Egalitarian, I think that you know what that would be. Religious, and liberalism is just how conservative or liberal a person rated themselves. Those 4 traits all showed an impact of growing up in the same home. And 3 academic. So I think it's unfortunate. The one down here is vocabulary, which I think the correlation is about 0.18. The years of education, the highest degree, it's not surprising that those look similar since they're highly correlated with one another. And the vocabulary all had correlations of at least 15%. So there are some traits, I would argue, that behavioral genetic literature would show that there are enduring impacts of growing up in the same home. And they primarily cluster, at least in our data, in 2 domains, social values and academics. And there's also income in here as well. The second thing, and I go through the second and third pretty quickly, I'll finish on it. The second thing that I think adoption research can allow us to do is, up to this point, I've just talked about percentage of variance in a phenotype that could be accounted for anonymously by some theoretical concept called the shared environment. But what about growing up in the same home? What's driving those correlations? Is there really passive GE correlation going on? Is that an explanation? So in non-adoptive families, the problem that Plomin and others have identified is that a relationship between some aspect of the rearing environment and offspring functioning may owe to an environmental impact, but also shared genes. In the adoptive families, absent selective placement, which in our case we've documented, it really only reflects environmental mechanisms. Again, I apologize, it gets cut off here. We've measured a lot of we started the study not to understand genetics, but to understand the family environment. So we've measured a lot of aspects of the family environment. We factor analyze them. When you factor analyze them, or when we factor analyze them, we come up with 8 domains I think it's 8 domains of environmental, of parenting, or the environment that these are in adolescence. The most important ones that I'll just highlight here are how involved your parents are, which is again a factor. So these are empirically coherent. It's parents being involved in their adolescence life, they're setting standards, and they're also setting expectations for academics. Parent achievement, whether or not a parent has a high IQ, a high status job, has a lot of education. Parent traditionalism, the extent to which parents endorse traditional values in their child rearing, use corporal punishment. And the other one I'll highlight here is parent help. How much the parent actually gets down with the kid. Again, this is in adolescence. Helps them with their homework, making sure their assignments are turned in on time, uses their social capital to try to get a kid their first job or an internship. What's cut off here is, among other things, is the ones that are highlighted in red actually can differ for the 2 offspring in a family, where the other ones don't differ. They're the same. Things like, your parent achievement is the same for the 2. So just quickly, so I finish up on time. These are the correlations for the social values domain. Again, I'm going to just focus on those 8 phenotypes for which we found strong evidence, I would say strong evidence, for a shared environmental effect in adulthood. So these are the correlations. I give them for non-adoptive, but I'm really interested in the adoptive families, which is the one on the left. And you see a pattern that I think you would expect. Kids who end up being liberal, who are egalitarian, who endorse liberal social values, who are low in religiousness, have tended to come from homes where the parents did not follow traditional parenting practices. And to a certain extent, also that the parents were high-achieving parents. That suggests that, but it's maybe not all that remarkable, that these sorts of traits, the mechanism of the shared environmental effect, owes, at least in part, to the traditional parenting, although, of course, causal inference is always challenging. The second domain that was identified was the academic domain. Again, I'm not going to really, the patterns are the same. The correlation is a little higher in the non-adopted. In the adopted families, you see more factors being relevant to academic outcomes. I've included income here as well. Is actually the strongest prediction comes from having involved parents, having high-achieving parents second, and then having a strong school and peers. One anomalous thing is that the more the parents helped, the lower the achievement of the children in terms of these outcomes, which may initially seem anomalous, which gets me to the last thing I want to say. So the second thing I think we begin to show, it's hard the causal inference is always hard, is that there are these shared environmental effects that persist into adulthood in certain domains. Secondly, that those are related to certain parenting practices that occurred in the adolescence of these individuals that are consistent, but certainly don't prove causality. And the last thing I just want to illustrate the helping effect here. There's also likely evocative, what Sandy Scar called evocative gene-environment correlation, is that the behavior of the offspring is in part driving the parent behavior. And when we have environmental factors that differ between 2 offspring, They might be differing because the parents are reacting to something in the kids. Well, kind of a complicated slide, but our design actually allows us to draw inferences about that, whether or not parents seem to be reacting to differences in the kid. Between family effects, the overall effect of helping, which is negative, is actually a compounding of two sources in our sample, given the sampling framework, which is we're sampling families. There are between family effects, which is on average, do parents who help children have children who achieve more? But there's also within family effects. Who is the child in the family that they're helping more? And it turns out that helping or even involvement, that they're actually different within family and between family effects that helps explain the anomaly. So I'm just going to show it for helping. For the helping effect, the green is the overall effect that I gave you before. So the green effect shows that overall in our sample, the more parents helped, the lower the likelihood of a high degree or a large number of years of education or a large vocabulary score. Those are the green bars. The red bars are within family. And what you see is within family, that effect is much more stronger. So what's going on within families? If you have two kids in the family and one's struggling academically, the parents preferentially look to be helping that kid. Between family, there's a positive effect. So parents between families who help more actually have kids who on average do better. It's the within family effect that produces the overall negative effect. And it's probably owing to evocative GE correlation. I'm going to skip the next two to make sure I finish on slide 8. There's a concern. If you want to talk, we can talk at a break or something. There's a concern, legitimate, about selection and adoption studies. So, right, adoptive families are not representative in any way. There's a ways for correcting that. Given in our design, we built that in. And when we correct for it, it doesn't really change the pattern of results. It increases the magnitude of the shared environmental effect, but it doesn't increase the pattern of results. So that's what those two slides. So maybe some of you are thinking about, I'm coming to the end here. Okay, so this is all well and good, but what the heck did Matt ever do for his kids? So those are my kids. Those are my daughters. It's an old picture. It's a little over 20 years old. And I know what most of you are thinking right now. Matt was a bad dad. He couldn't even put them in shoes. Well, I got a raise a little bit after this, and I did put them in shoes. So, and as best I can tell, they turned out so well, pretty okay. I have no idea what impact I've had on their life. I can't. There's no way. What's the counterfactual? I don't have any idea. I think I have had an impact. I have no idea that my dad and mom impact me. I believe I do. And I probably believe I do, not in the academic domain, but in the social values domain. But right, in the individual case, I don't think you can tell. But I'm going to go to my grave believing that I both impacted my daughters and my dad and mom impacted me. What can we reasonably conclude? I think for most psychological traits, I think the behavioral geneticists are probably right. The C-squared effect is less than 10%, probably quite a bit less than 10%. Growing up in the same home doesn't probably matter in adulthood for a lot of things like volunteering, being a good citizen, even mental health and that sort of thing. It has a very low effect. And if studies are coming out, and they still do come out, showing a correlation between parenting behavior and offspring functioning, for these traits, it probably owes to passive gene-environment correlation confounding. In adolescence, there are multiple traits where the shared environment, at least in our data, account for 10 to 25% of the variance. It's not trivial, but as Tom would say, that's adolescence. What about adulthood? In adulthood, the effects for most traits appear to go down, but again, we don't have necessarily longitudinal data on all our traits. But there are some traits that do show an enduring impact of growing up in the same home. Those traits cluster in two domains. The two domains being social values, and academics, which if you think about it, probably makes sense. I don't know many parents who are out there trying to make their kids more extroverted, but I think there are a lot of parents who want their kids to do well in school and to be moral beings. So that probably makes a lot of sense. I'll skip this. This is just a rehash of that. Much of the results I've presented here are based on published data, but not all of it. Yeah, I know you can't read this. It's typing. It's too small. But these are some of the publications, many of which come from James and Emily and Alex, who are the young people who will carry on this research. And I appreciate your time, and thank you very much. Okay.
It's time for a few questions. Who would like to ask that? And then David.
Yeah, I wonder about sexual orientation. That's a trait that I would be extremely.
Yes, yeah. It's so we did measure it, and in our sample, there are not enough people. We don't have the power. I'll look at it. If you give me your name, I'll look at it and I'll give you our results. But it's not enough, right? So it's not a trivial sample, but it's not large enough. I think we have a scale. I forget what it is. It's a standard scale. Maybe you would know. It goes like exclusively homosexual, exclusively heterosexual, both in behavior and in, I forget in terms of underlying feelings. And we do have that, but I don't know that there's enough variability. We have 1,200 offspring. We didn't ask it. Parents sometimes get upset if you ask things like that. So we waited until they got a little bit older, but we did ask it. If you give me, I'll look. I haven't done. I think it is very interesting. Yeah.
Matt, I'm just curious. Traditional behavior genetic designs seek to explain variance, and I'm wondering if there are any analyses of parental effects looking at means that take, say, a multi-level modeling point of view. I think Judy Harris has a lot going for her when she talks about peers socializing peers, but parents, they'll move to the right neighborhood. And so they seek out different peer groups for their kids to socialize them. So maybe at one level of analysis, Judy is right, but at another level of analysis, looking at mean impact, parents do have an effect by seeing to it that kids get a better environment.
I think on that count, Judy has a good point. I don't know the data that would actually support it. It's kind of challenging because parents have different goals. So exactly how you assess that is challenging. But I do think some parents are pretty savvy, like Judy was, and she talks about her own children that she reared and the complications, and they recognize the limits that they might have on their children. What degrees of freedom do the parents have, and what do they not have?
Yeah.
And they act accordingly. So maybe they move. So maybe they make sure that their children are exposed to a peer group, since peers are going to be, she would argue, are more important. But we haven't assessed it. It's a very tricky thing to assess.
But I think of you and the story you shared last time about moving to a different country.
Oh yeah, it was. That was yeah.
You know?
Yeah, with my oldest daughter. Sorry, indulgence, but I did. I moved to another country to get her out of trouble. So.
Lots of people send their kids off to private school or something.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah. That's
But
right.
not everybody has.
One more. Okay. Oh, you have to cut it. So I talked to you at the break. I apologize. I went too long. So.
So thank you very much.
Okay. Thank you very much. Okay.